Hi, I'm Myron, and this is the story of how my mother said she regretted having me, just 2 days before Child Protective Services came for my little sister. When I came home, there was no hug, just a spare key under a flower pot and a dinner table where my chair had vanished. But Elora, 10 years old, too quiet for her age, slipped a smooth stone into my pocket and whispered, "This one's for safety." Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever felt like an outsider in your own family? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a family drama you don't want to miss. Some people come home to casseroles and hugs. I came home to a spare key under a flower pot and a couch that smelled like quiet disappointment. It was colder than I expected for late November, the kind of cold that sneaks into your sleeves before you even turn the key. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but maybe that's just how memory works when you've been gone too long. I stood on the porch for a beat, thinking about driving off again. But I didn't. I reached under the same chipped pot, found the key still taped in place, and let myself in. The scent hit me first. Cinnamon and old fabric softener. Then came the silence, thick and immediate. I hadn't even set my bag down when I spotted Gwen at the kitchen table, bent over a crossword like I hadn't just walked in after years. "There's chicken in the oven," she said flatly, not even looking up. "Help yourself." No welcome, no hug, not even a "why are you here?" Just instructions and the familiar undertone of control. It was exactly what I'd expected, and somehow worse. I walked through the hall, noting how nothing had changed. Same faded family pictures lined the walls, except none of me. Not since I was 19. I paused at the frame where my senior photo used to be. Now it holds Elora's third-grade class portrait. The switch wasn't subtle. I found the guest room, which used to be mine, stacked with winter coats and unopened Amazon boxes. So I dropped my duffel near the couch and sat for a moment, letting the silence settle over me. A quiet so practiced it felt almost rehearsed. Dinner was served in stiff movements: roast chicken, green bean casserole, cornbread muffins. Everything tasted like obligation. Gwen picked at her food, clearly irritated that I was still here. She finally broke the tension with, "We thought maybe you'd grown up by now." I chewed slowly and replied, "I came because you asked." "I asked for someone to watch Elora, that's all." Elora sat across from me, sleeves pulled past her wrists despite the heat pumping through the house. Her hair had gotten longer, falling into her eyes. She didn't speak much, she never had. But there was something deeper now. Something I couldn't name. Under the table, I felt a light tap against my leg. I glanced down and she'd slipped a small, smooth object into my lap. A stone. Green, polished, shaped by time and small hands. I curled my fingers around it, heart tightening for reasons I didn't understand. After we cleared the dishes, I wandered into the living room. The chair by the window, the one Dad used to call his thinking spot, was buried beneath boxes marked "Donate." Gwen had turned it into a storage shelf. I stood beside it, looking out into the backyard, the swing set leaning slightly in the wind. That chair had once been where I sat every Saturday morning with Dad, playing I Spy and eating cinnamon toast. Now it was just another forgotten corner. Gwen's voice came sharp from the kitchen. "If you came here to stir up the past, maybe it's best you didn't come at all." I turned to look at her, my mouth half open, but nothing came out. The years between us stretched like rubber bands, too thin to hold, too tense to ignore. "I'm not here for the past," I said, though even I wasn't sure that was true. She scoffed and walked away, her footsteps clipped and quick, like she needed distance as much as I did. Elora lingered in the hallway, her arms crossed, eyes scanning mine, as if looking for proof of something she'd been told wasn't real. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words didn't make it out. I looked at Elora, and in her silence, I saw something I'd buried in myself. In our house, silence wasn't peaceful. It was punishment in disguise. Elora didn't say anything as we walked toward the car that morning. She held her lunchbox like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. Frost clung to the windshield, and the heater took its time warming up. She slid into the back seat without being told, legs dangling above the floor mats. Halfway to Maplebrook Elementary, she spoke so softly I almost missed it. Em la me tuk toi. Em luk now kung vai. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I wanted to ask what that meant, what exactly she'd done to make Gwen angry, but something in her posture stopped me. Shoulders curled inward, gaze fixed on her thumbs. She wasn't fishing for comfort. She was bracing for fallout. When I parked in front of the school, she didn't get out right away, just reached into her coat pocket and pulled out another smooth stone, this one a deep amber color. She leaned forward and slipped it into the pocket of my jacket. It keeps you safe, she whispered. I have 12. I watched her walk toward the gate, her coat too big, her backpack bouncing against her. That quiet had weight. It trailed behind her like a shadow no one else could see. I waited a minute before stepping out and following her to the front office. Gwen had insisted I check in with the principal to look responsible, whatever that meant. Maplebrook looked the same chipped paint, same squeaky hinges on the doors. In the hallway, a man in a maintenance vest was replacing a light bulb near the trophy case. He looked up as I passed, squinting slightly. Are you... Marin? I stopped. Yeah, You probably don't remember me. He smiled, stepping down from the ladder. Julian Cross, we met 3 years ago. You helped me with that family law paperwork, legal aid center in Montpelier. The name hit me like a light flickering on. I did remember. He'd come in desperate to get custody after his ex moved states with their son. I'd stayed after my shift to walk him through the process. I got my boy back, he said, grin softening. You didn't have to help, but you did. I never forgot that. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, and he gave a small wave before disappearing down the hallway. Principal Rosner met me in the office with a handshake and the distracted energy of someone juggling 20 fires. He was polite, mentioned Elora was quiet but bright, and made a vague comment about holiday crafts. I left with more questions than answers. I drove straight to Millie's diner after. The bell over the door jingled, and the warmth inside felt almost theatrical, like stepping into a memory someone had dressed up for tourists. Millie's hadn't changed. The booths were still red vinyl, the counter still cluttered with glass sugar jars and ceramic mugs. A couple of older men sat near the window, arguing over crossword clues. A woman in her 70s stirred her tea while her schnauzer peeked out from under the table. "Morning, hun," the waitress said as I sat down. "Still drink it black?" I blinked. "Yeah?" She set a mug in front of me and smiled. "Didn't think I'd see you again. You back for good or just for the holidays?" I smiled politely. "Helping out with family." She raised an eyebrow. "Your mom still run the choir fundraisers and make everyone feel like they undertipped?" I huffed a laugh. "That sounds about right." She slid a menu toward me, but I waved it off. I wasn't hungry. The coffee was enough. At the far end of the counter, a trio of women in pastel windbreakers chatted over oatmeal and muffins. "I saw her again yesterday," one of them murmured. "Elora?" Mm-hmm. Poor thing was crying in the bathroom. Again. She's always by herself at recess, too. They weren't whispering. They weren't even trying to keep it down. I looked away, stared at my reflection in the chrome napkin holder until it blurred. When I left, I slid $2 under the edge of my untouched mug. The waitress saw and said gently, "You didn't have to." "I know," I said. "That's why I did." Back home, the house felt heavier. Gwen's car was in the driveway. Inside, the lights were off, though the sun had already dipped low behind the trees. I stepped through the front door and stopped short. In the middle of the hallway, Elora was on her knees with a rag in one hand, a bowl of soapy water next to her. The smell of spilled milk and bleach mixed unpleasantly in the air. "Why are you doing that?" I asked. She startled, looking up at me like I'd caught her stealing. Gwen stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes hard. "She knocked her glass over," Gwen said. "She's old enough to clean up her own mess." "She's 10. And she's not bleeding, is she?" Elora didn't speak. She pressed the rag to the floor, scrubbing harder. I noticed her lip trembled, but she never let a tear fall. Just pressed her mouth shut like that might keep the rest of her from unraveling. I stood in the doorway, watching my mother kneel like a queen, and wondered if I was the only one seeing the cracks in her crown. The image of my sister, scared and trembling before my mother's eyes and words, made my heart ache. As a mother, how could I treat a 10-year-old like that? What should I do now? If it were you, what would you do? Leave your comment below to give me a solution. Now, let's get to the next development of this story. It was Tuesday, cold, gray, quiet, until a car with a state seal pulled up in front of our house. I was rinsing a coffee mug in the sink when I saw it through the kitchen window. White sedan, official-looking plates, emblem on the door. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up. The kind of sinking you feel when you know something's about to change, but you don't know how much or how fast. "Elora!" Gwen called sharply from the hallway. "Get your coat! Now!" I turned, wiping my hands on a dish towel as Elora shuffled into view. She was holding her old stuffed bear, the one with one ear that always flopped sideways. She clutched it like a lifeline. The knock on the door was calm, measured. Gwen didn't move. For a second, I thought she might pretend no one was home. Then the knock came again, firmer. "I'll get it," I said, already walking toward the door. She stepped in front of me. "You don't speak. You don't say a word." The woman at the door introduced herself as Camille Rowe, from the Vermont Department for Children and Families. Her tone was soft, almost apologetic, like she'd rather be anywhere else. She had a folder in her hands and a badge clipped to her jacket. "Just here for a follow-up on a report we received. Nothing formal yet," she said, eyes scanning the room behind me. Gwen was all teeth now. "You called them, didn't you? You spiteful little—" "I didn't call anyone," I said quietly. She snorted. "Right. You just happened to show up and now they come knocking?" Camille cut in gently. "Actually, the report came from within the school system. Anonymous, but signed by a verified adult male staff member. We're just here to ensure Elora is safe and supported." "Of course she's safe," Gwen snapped. "This is ridiculous." Camille smiled politely. "May I speak to Elora? Privately, if possible." Gwen hesitated. Elora looked at me, panic flickering behind her eyes. I knelt down and brushed her hair gently behind one ear. "It's okay," I said. "She just wants to talk. Nothing bad's going to happen." Elora nodded slowly and followed Camille into the living room. I stayed near the archway, not listening, just waiting. Gwen stood behind me, arms crossed so tightly, I wondered if she was holding herself together by force. The silence was loud. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel and the creak of the floorboards every time Alora shifted. After what felt like forever, Camille stood and thanked Alora. Then she turned to Gwen with a more formal tone. For now, we'll be placing Alora in temporary protective care while we complete our assessment. It's not a permanent removal, just precautionary. Gwen exploded. You can't do this! You don't have proof. This is my child. Actually, Camille said calmly, the state does have grounds under Preliminary Report 8B, emotional neglect and coercive discipline. Based on Alora's account, corroborated by school records, we're initiating a 72-hour observation period. Gwen's face went white, then red. You will regret this, she spat. I swear to you, both of you. I didn't respond. I knelt again as Alora walked toward me. She was shaking. Her backpack looked too big for her shoulders. She threw her arms around me, tighter than I expected, burying her face against my neck. Thank you for seeing me, she whispered, in a voice so small I almost thought I imagined it. I held her a few seconds longer than I was supposed to. Camille didn't stop me. When they stepped out the door, the cold rushed in again. Gwen stormed into the kitchen, slamming cabinets without purpose. I sat down on the couch, numb. On the cushion beside me was another stone, smooth, deep blue, like a lake at night. I didn't call them, but someone did. And I think I know who. The house felt bigger without her. Not quieter, just lonelier. It had only been a few hours since Alora left, but everything already felt stretched thin and hollow. The floor creaked louder. The wind outside had a sharper whistle. Even the clock in the hallway seemed to tick more deliberately, like it was trying to fill the silence she left behind. I wandered from room to room, unable to settle. Gwen's door was shut tight, no sounds behind it. She hadn't said a word since Camille and Alora left. I hadn't expected much, but the complete erasure stung more than I cared to admit. In the small bedroom, Alora had called hers. The air still smelled faintly of strawberries and dryer sheets. Her blanket was bunched at the foot of the bed, and one sock peeked out from under the dresser. I sat on the edge of the mattress and let my eyes travel across the room. Small drawings taped crookedly to the wall, a chipped ceramic cat on the windowsill, the frayed edge of her favorite book cover. I opened the top drawer of her dresser, intending only to fold the few shirts left behind. Beneath a stack of notebooks, I found a bundle of paper tied with yarn. Sketches. Dozens of them. They were all of the same scene. Two girls, one taller, one small, sitting side by side on a porch, a gray cat curled at their feet. Sometimes they held mugs. Sometimes one had her head on the other's shoulder. But the faces were always us, me and Alora. My throat tightened. A soft knock on the front door startled me. It was Miss Thelma, bundled in a thick scarf and clutching a pie tin wrapped in foil. Her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, but her gaze held something knowing beneath the warmth. "Thought you might need something sweet," she said, handing over the tin. "Still warm?" I invited her in, and she stepped carefully out of her boots. She moved slowly these days, but her presence filled the space in a way that made the air feel less brittle. She followed me into the kitchen and set the pie on the counter, unwrapping it with gentle fingers. Apple with nutmeg. My late husband's favorite. He used to say the smell alone could fix a broken heart. She looked around, then back at me. "I heard." I nodded. She didn't pry, just poured 2 glasses of cider from the fridge without asking, like she used to when I was a kid, hanging around her fence looking for conversation. "Your mother," she said slowly, "isn't cruel on purpose, but she never learned how to love without trying to control. That's a dangerous kind of love, Marin, one that always leaves bruises you can't explain." I didn't reply, just sipped the cider and let her words settle. After she left, I wandered into the basement. The stairs groaned under my weight. I hadn't been down there in years, not since before I left at 19, the night before Thanksgiving, when Gwen told me, "If you can't behave, don't bother coming back." The air smelled like old boxes and dust. I ran my fingers along the shelves until I found it, an old photo album with a cracked leather spine. I carried it upstairs and sat cross-legged on the rug by the radiator. The pictures were grainy, faded at the corners. Halloween costumes, beach trips, Gwen smiling like she meant it. Then, near the middle, a photo of me at 13, holding baby Elora on my lap. My eyes were swollen. I must have cried before the picture. But I was smiling, barely. And Elora, in her overalls and crooked pigtails, was beaming like I was the sun. Tucked inside the back cover was a folded slip of paper, a note in my father's handwriting. "Take care of each other when I can't." I read it twice, 3 times. The ink had faded, but his words hadn't. I looked back at the photo, at my younger self, bruised and exhausted, and at Elora, all joy and light. I traced the edge of the picture with my thumb. I thought I was forgotten, but maybe the house just didn't know how to remember me yet. It wasn't addressed to me, but I knew that handwriting, and it said everything she couldn't say out loud. I was folding the blankets on Elora's bed when I noticed the pillowcase sagging oddly on one end. I reached inside, half expecting a sock or a crumpled tissue. Instead, I pulled out a folded piece of paper, soft with wear. Her handwriting curled across the page in narrow, careful strokes, more drawing than writing. At the top was a small sketch of a cat with crooked whiskers. I sat on the bed, unfolded the letter, and started to read. "Dear somebody, if I'm not here, maybe this will help you know the parts I couldn't say out loud. I didn't know which grown-up to tell. Most grown-ups don't like when kids say scary things. So I wrote it down instead. My throat tightened. Sometimes when I cry, Mom says, 'You're just like her.' She means you, I think. But I don't think that's bad. One time, I dropped a plate when drying dishes. She told me it was a family plate and I didn't respect anything. She made me sleep on the porch. It was cold, but I stayed quiet so she wouldn't get madder. Another time, I drank her iced tea without asking. She threw the whole cup in the sink and told me, 'You're lucky anyone keeps you around. But I'm not telling you to get her in trouble. I just want someone to know. That way, if I go away, you'll remember.' I had to stop reading. My eyes burned. I blinked hard, pressed the paper to my chest, and stared at the pale morning light breaking through the window. Elora had trusted me, not to fix it, not to save her, just to witness her truth. A message buzzed on my phone. "Julian, can you meet me behind Maplebrook at noon? I have something to return. A small debt, long overdue." I replied yes and tried to pull myself together. I folded Elora's letter carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of my coat. The playground behind Maplebrook looked abandoned. The wind nudged the swings slightly, and the grass was stiff with frost. Julian was already there, hands in his jacket pockets, a knit cap pulled low over his ears. "You came," he said. I nodded. "I found her letter this morning." His expression softened. "Then this will make more sense." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small USB drive, sealed in a plastic bag. "I maintain the school security system. Was replacing a few hard drives last month and came across a clip. Didn't think much of it until I saw Laura with that stuffed bear and remembered things. What's on it? Nothing dramatic, but clear enough. Gwen, cornering her, not touching, but the words. Sharp enough to cut air. I held the drive in my hand, afraid to crush it. Why give it to me? He shrugged. Because you gave me a packet of legal forms and a second chance. 3 years ago, I had no job, no custody rights, and a file no one wanted to read. You stayed late that day. You said, just because no one else believes you doesn't mean you stop telling the truth. I don't even remember saying that. Well, I do. And now, this is me not forgetting. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he offered his hand. I shook it, surprised by how solid and steady his grip felt. No need to thank me, he said. Some things aren't debts. They're just the next right thing. He turned and walked away before I could reply. Back in the car, I plugged the USB into my laptop. The file was 28 seconds long. No yelling, no slamming doors. Just Gwen's voice, taut and low. Why do you think anyone would want you around if you keep acting like this? Elora's shoulders flinched. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just nodded, clutching her bear, eyes focused on the floor. I closed the laptop. I cried then. Not the loud kind. The quiet, breathless kind that sits deep in your chest and steals the warmth from your hands. Not just for Elora, for myself. For the child I used to be. For the silence we'd both lived inside. When I stood to put my coat away, something slid from the inner pocket and landed on the floor. Another stone. This one pale, with specks of silver. She didn't ask me to come back, but she left a trail of stones for me anyway. Mom's door was open. For once, she wasn't trying to shut me out. She just left. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't a trick of the morning light or a gust of wind. The room that had always been closed, always locked tight against conversation, was wide open. The bed was made, the closet half empty. And on the kitchen table, placed gently beside the photo of me and Elora I'd found days earlier, was a note in Gwen's looping handwriting. I need time. The sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting long bands of gold across the tile. The house smelled faintly of reheated apple pie. I didn't touch the note. I didn't need to. The message wasn't meant to start a conversation. It was an ending. Or maybe a pause. I made coffee, strong and plain, and walked through the rooms without needing to whisper or tiptoe. The air felt lighter, as if the walls had exhaled. In Elora's room, I placed her stuffed bear back on the bed. I propped it against her pillow and smoothed the blanket beneath it. Then, from the envelope Camille had mailed the day before, I took out the last polished stone, smooth pale blue with a swirl like a fingerprint, and set it gently beside the bear. Tucked into the package had been a short letter in Elora's handwriting. I'm not sure if you want me, but I know you see me. I sat there for a while, just breathing, fingers resting on the edge of the note. She didn't need promises. She needed to be seen. And somehow, that made me feel steadier than anything else had in years. The phone rang. Camille. I just wanted to let you know Elora's doing well, she said. She's been placed with a temporary care family for now. Somewhere quiet, safe. She asked me to tell you, if you ever want her back, in the future, she'd like that. My voice caught. Tell her I'll always want her. I thought so, Camille said gently. She also asked if the bear made it back to you. It did. There was a small silence on the line. Then Camille added, You did right by her, you know. After the call, I opened the cabinet above the stove and pulled out a small frame. It had once held a faded photo of my high school graduation. Now, I swapped it for a drawing Elora had made, the two of us sitting under a tree, a cat sleeping between us. I hung it in the hallway where the other family photos used to be. Then I pulled out my laptop. Dust floated in the beam of light pouring through the window as I opened a long-forgotten browser tab and typed in a web address I hadn't visited in years, quietshelter.org. It was a project I'd started in nursing school, meant to be a resource hub for sisters and daughters, and women who felt like they didn't belong at the tables they were born into. I'd let it expire once life got too loud. But the domain was mine again, and this time, I didn't want it to just be digital noise. I posted a message. "You're not alone. I see you." A soft ping told me someone had visited the page. Then another, then one more. 3 strangers? Or maybe not so strange. Outside, the air was crisp with Thanksgiving morning. A light wind rustled the leaves that had clung to the maple tree out back. I took the chair, the old one I'd fixed a week ago, and carried it across the yard. I set it under the tree, right where the sun hit the grass in late morning. The screws were tight, the wood smooth and warm. It wasn't a seat from anyone else's table. It wasn't an inheritance. It was something I had repaired with my own hands, made solid again, not for myself, but for whoever needed it next. I didn't need a seat at their table. I was building a longer one, with space for anyone who never got to sit down. Some homes echo louder in someone's absence than they ever did in their presence. That Thanksgiving morning, it wasn't the quiet that caught me. It was the way the silence finally made room to breathe. Kindness, I've learned, isn't always loud or decorated in praise. Sometimes it's a letter tucked in a pillow, a worn teddy bear returned, or a broken chair quietly mended. The softest forms of love are often the ones that endure the longest. When we stop measuring people by where they sit, or if they're even invited at all, we begin to see the strength it takes just to show up. And maybe that's the seat that matters most, the one we make space for, even when no one else does.